The settlement of New Haven wasn't much to look at, just a handful of biodomes scattered across the red soil of HD 209458b, humanity's newest colony world. But to 12-year-old Tara Patel, those domes contained entire universes of possibility, especially in the community kitchen where she spent most of her time experimenting with both Earth and local ingredients. Tara had inherited her grandmother's gift for cooking, though she preferred to think of it as edible chemistry. Her specialty was a healing soup that combined earth ginger and garlic with the medicinal properties of local herbs. The colony's doctor had even started prescribing it to patients, earning Tara the nickname, the Kitchen Witch. On the day everything changed, Tara was foraging for shadowleaf, a local plant with remarkable anti-inflammatory properties, in the valley beyond the settlement's perimeter. The twin suns were setting, painting the sky in sheets of purple and gold, when she heard it, a sound like thunder, followed by the unmistakable screech of tortured metal. She should have run back to the settlement. Instead, she followed the sound. Behind a cluster of rust-colored rocks, she found them, three tall figures in damaged environmental suits, their silvery skin visible through tears in the fabric. Zentari warriors, she realized, her heart hammering against her ribs. Everyone knew about the Zentari, a proud race of warriors who controlled half the known galaxy. But what were they doing here, so far from their territory? One of them was clearly injured, silver blood seeping from a gash in their side. Their breathing came in sharp, whistling gasps that didn't sound healthy at all. The other two were trying to help, but their movements seemed uncoordinated, almost drunk. Tara recognized the symptoms immediately: altitude sickness combined with exposure to the planet's unique atmospheric composition. Without proper treatment, they would be dead within hours. She thought about the soup simmering back in her kitchen, the one she'd modified specifically for the planet's harsh environment. Before she could talk herself out of it, she was already moving. "Don't move," she called out, raising her hands to show they were empty. "I can help." The warriors spun toward her with impressive speed despite their condition. One raised a weapon, but the movement was sluggish, unsteady. "I'm Tara," she continued, forcing her voice to remain steady. "I'm a healer, well, sort of. I make medicine. You're suffering from atmospheric poisoning, and your friend is bleeding. I can help with both." The Zentari exchanged looks. Their faces were difficult to read, their features more geometric than human, with crystalline patterns that shifted colors with their emotions. Right now, they were cycling between deep purples and agitated reds. The one holding the weapon spoke, their voice surprisingly melodic despite its alien timbre. "Why would you help us, small human?" Tara thought about all the reasons she shouldn't. These were warriors from a species known for their rigid honor code and occasional brutality. But she also thought about her grandmother's words: "Food is a universal language, Beta. When you cook for someone, you're saying, 'I want you to live.' Because you're sick, and I can help," she said simply. "Wait here. Please." She ran back to her kitchen, her heart pounding with equal parts fear and excitement. Working quickly, she filled 3 containers with her healing soup, adding extra shadowleaf for its anti-inflammatory properties. She grabbed some basic medical supplies too, just in case. When she returned, she half expected the warriors to be gone. But they were exactly where she'd left them, though their colors had shifted to a curious blue-green. "This will help with the atmospheric poisoning and reduce inflammation," she explained, setting down the containers. "It's safe for your biology. I've studied xenophysiology as a hobby. The shadowleaf I use is actually related to a plant that grows on one of your colony worlds." The warriors stared at the containers, then at her. Finally, the injured one reached out with a trembling hand and accepted the soup. They retracted their environmental helmet, revealing a face that looked like it had been carved from living crystal, and took a careful sip. The effect was almost immediate. The crystalline patterns on their face shifted from sickly purple to a healthy azure. The other 2 warriors watched intently, then followed suit. This taste, the first warrior said, their voice stronger now. It carries memories. Like the healing broths of our ancient times. Terra beamed. That's probably the shadow leaf. It has similar properties to your world's crystal bloom. I read about it in a xenobotany database. The warriors finished their soup in reverent silence. When they were done, their colors had stabilized to a deep, peaceful blue, and their breathing had returned to normal. The leader fixed Terra with an intense gaze. You have done more than heal us, small one. You have honored us with ancient knowledge and wisdom beyond your years. This debt must be acknowledged. Oh, no debt, Terra said quickly. It's just soup. But the warrior was already removing something from their suit, a small crystal that pulsed with inner light. This marks you as a friend of the Zentari. Show it to any of our kind, and they will know you as one who honors the old ways. Before Terra could protest further, a sound like distant thunder rolled across the valley. The warriors looked up sharply. Our extraction arrives, the leader said. We must go. But this meeting will not be forgotten, Era the healer. They departed as quickly as their recovered strength allowed, leaving Terra holding the crystal and 3 empty soup containers. As she watched their ship disappear into the darkening sky, she had no way of knowing that her simple act of kindness, her grandmother's recipe combined with local herbs, would soon set in motion events that would reshape the relationship between humans and Zentari forever. Back in her kitchen, as she cleaned up and prepared for the next day's cooking, the crystal pulsed warmly in her pocket. Somewhere above, in the vast expanse of space, 3 Zentari warriors were telling their superiors about a small human healer who honored the old ways, and whose soup tasted like a memory of home. News travels fast in space, but traditions travel faster. Within days of the warriors' return to their homeworld, word of Terra's deed had spread through the crystalline halls of the Zentari High Council. The tale grew with each telling, a human child who not only aided warriors in distress but did so through ancient healing arts thought lost to time. In the council's vast chamber, carved from a single massive crystal, High Elder Vexthor stood before the assembled leaders, his facets shimmering with barely contained excitement. The warrior's medical scans confirm it, he announced, his voice resonating through the chamber. The healing broth contained elements identical to our ancestral remedies. Remedies we believed lost during the Great Scatter. Whispers rippled through the chamber, crystalline faces shifting through colors of amazement and disbelief. Council member Zira, known for her cautious nature, spoke up. A human child discovering our ancient healing arts? This cannot be coincidence. Meanwhile, back on HD 209458B, Terra was dealing with her own form of attention. Word had somehow leaked about her encounter with the Zentari warriors. Colonial security officers had questioned her for hours, while xenobiologists begged for her recipe. She'd given them the ingredient list but kept the proportions to herself. Some things needed to stay secret. Her father, Raj, watched all this with growing concern. Maybe we should consider moving somewhere else, he suggested one evening as Terra experimented with a new variation of her soup. Somewhere quieter. Dad, we can't leave, Terra replied, carefully measuring out dried shadow leaf. My garden is here. My kitchen is here. And she touched the crystal in her pocket, which hadn't stopped its gentle pulsing since that night. I think something important is happening. She was more right than she knew. In orbit above their colony, 3 Zentari diplomatic vessels had just emerged from hyperspace. Their arrival sent the colonial government into chaos. No one had expected the Zentari to take such direct interest in a frontier settlement. The colonial governor, Jessica Way, watched the ships through her office window with a mixture of fear and hope. They're saying it's about a soup, she muttered to her aide. Can you believe that? Generations of diplomatic efforts, and we might achieve first meaningful contact over a bowl of soup. But not everyone viewed these developments with optimism. In the shadows between stars, other powers watched and worried. The Drachnid Consortium, ancient rivals of the Zentari, saw the growing connection between humans and Zentari as a threat to their influence. The Merchants Guild feared what this could mean for their monopoly on interstellar trade. On a secure channel that bounced between a dozen relay stations, two figures discussed the situation. "The girl must be neutralized," one shadow said. "Before this goes any further." "Agreed," replied another. "But carefully. The Zentari are protective of their traditions. If they've truly marked her as one who knows the old ways." Back in her kitchen, blissfully unaware of the plots forming around her, Terra received her first official visitor. A Zentari diplomat, their crystalline face shifting through formal patterns of blue and gold, arrived with an escort of colonial officials. "I am Kexley," the diplomat announced, bowing slightly. "The High Council has sent me to extend an invitation. They wish to honor you properly, young healer." Terra's hand clutched the crystal in her pocket. "Honor me? But I just made soup." Kexley's face rippled with what might have been amusement. "You did far more than that. You showed wisdom beyond your years, compassion beyond boundaries, and knowledge that echoes our most sacred traditions. The High Council wishes you to prepare your healing broth in our sacred halls." The colonial officials exchanged shocked glances. No human had ever been invited to the Zentari homeworld, let alone to their sacred halls. Raj stepped forward protectively. "She's just a child." "A child who has awakened ancient memories," Kexley replied. "We understand your concern. You would, of course, accompany her. And you would be under the highest protection our empire can offer." Before anyone could respond, alarms began blaring throughout the settlement. Governor Wei's voice crackled over the emergency system, multiple unidentified ships approaching. "All citizens to shelter immediately." Through the kitchen window, Terra saw them, sleek black ships cutting through the atmosphere like knives. They weren't Zentari vessels, these were something else entirely. Kexley's face shifted to alarming patterns of red and violet. "Drachnid vessels," they hissed. "They dare." But Terra was already moving, pulling ingredients from her shelves. "Help me," she ordered, surprising everyone with her commanding tone. "If those ships are carrying soldiers, they'll need to adapt to our atmosphere quickly. And I'm betting they haven't prepared for it properly." Understanding dawned on Kexley's face. "You would help potential enemies?" "I help people who need helping," Terra replied firmly, channeling her grandmother's wisdom. "That's what healers do. Now, are you going to stand there, or are you going to help me prepare enough soup for an invasion?" As the black ships descended and colony sirens wailed, Terra stood in her kitchen, surrounded by worried adults, calmly preparing to face an alien incursion with nothing but soup and wisdom. The crystal in her pocket pulsed stronger than ever, as if approving of her choice. What no one realized yet was that this moment, a child choosing to help potential enemies instead of hiding from them, would become as legendary as her first encounter with the Zentari warriors. The ripples of her decision would soon turn into waves that would reshape the very nature of interstellar diplomacy. The next few hours unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance of chaos. As Drachnid ships landed on the outskirts of New Haven, Terra orchestrated what could only be described as the most unusual defensive operation in colonial history. Her kitchen had transformed into a command center, with both humans and Zentari working side by side, preparing massive quantities of atmospheric adaptation soup. "More Shadowleaf," Terra directed, her small voice carrying surprising authority. "And double the portion of starroot. The Drachnid metabolism runs hotter than the Zentari's." She had spent enough time studying xenobiology to know that the Drachnid, with their silicon-based biology, would be even more susceptible to the planet's unique atmosphere than the Zentari had been. Kexley, the Zentari diplomat, watched in fascination as colonial defense forces carried containers of soup to the perimeter instead of weapons. You are either very brave or very foolish, young one, they observed, their crystalline features shifting between admiration and concern. Maybe both, Tara replied, not looking up from her work. But grandmother always said that an empty stomach makes for poor decisions. And right now, we need everyone thinking clearly. The first contact with the Drachnid forces came at sunset. They emerged from their ships in environmental suits that were clearly struggling with the planet's atmosphere. Their movements were already showing signs of the same disorientation that had affected the Zentari warriors. Governor Wei stood at the colony's perimeter, flanked by security forces and, unusually, a 12-year-old girl carrying a large container of soup. The Drachnid commander, a towering figure with iridescent scales and multiple arms, approached with weapons raised. This colony is now under Drachnid protection, the commander announced, their voice distorted by their failing environmental systems. Resist, and, they stumbled, clearly fighting the effects of atmospheric poisoning. Tara stepped forward before anyone could stop her. Your environmental suits aren't calibrated for our atmosphere's unique magnetic properties, she stated matter-of-factly. In about 10 minutes, you'll all be unconscious. Or. She held up the container. You could try my soup. The commander's multifaceted eyes narrowed. You expect us to accept food from potential enemies? I expect you to make a practical decision, Tara replied. I've already helped the Zentari with the same problem. You can check with them. She gestured to Kexley, who nodded confirmation. The Drachnid soldiers exchanged glances as their systems continued to deteriorate. Finally, the commander reached out with one of their 4 arms and accepted a container of soup. What followed was perhaps the strangest diplomatic scene in human history. Dozens of Drachnid soldiers sitting cross-legged on the red soil of HD 209458b, drinking soup made by a human child while Zentari diplomats watched and colonial security forces stood by in bewilderment. As the soup took effect, the tension in the air began to dissipate. The Drachnid commander's scales shifted from aggressive red to a more peaceful blue-green. This taste, they said, wonder creeping into their voice. It reminds me of the healing pools of our ancestral caves. Kexley stepped forward, their crystalline features pulsing with sudden understanding. Just as it reminded us of our ancient remedies. Perhaps this is not coincidence. Tara, who had been distributing soup with the help of colonial volunteers, paused. Different species, similar reactions to the same ingredients. That's not just biology, that's shared history. The revelation hit like a shockwave. Both the Zentari and Drachnid had legends of an ancient time when their peoples were not enemies, before the great scatter that had driven their species to different corners of the galaxy. Could this simple soup, created by a human child mixing Earth traditions with local herbs, have accidentally recreated something from that shared past? Governor Wei, watching the scene unfold, activated her communicator. Get me the Earth Diplomatic Corps, she ordered. And find every xenobiologist in the sector. I think we've just stumbled onto something bigger than a colonial dispute. As the twin suns set on New Haven, 3 species sat together under the purple sky, sharing soup and stories. The Drachnid commander and Kexley had begun comparing ancient legends, finding surprising similarities in their people's histories. Colonial officials were already drafting preliminary diplomatic agreements. And Tara, exhausted but satisfied, sat on the steps of her kitchen, watching it all unfold. The crystal the Zentari warriors had given her pulsed warmly in her pocket, but now she felt something else too, a subtle vibration from a small scale the Drachnid commander had gifted her, remarkably similar to the Zentari crystal. Your grandmother would be proud, her father said, sitting beside her. Though I doubt even she imagined her recipes would help prevent an interstellar incident. Tara smiled, thinking of the notes in her grandmother's old recipe book. Actually, she always said that the right food at the right time could solve almost any problem. I just didn't realize how right she was until today. But even as peace seemed to be taking hold on HD 209458b, new complications were brewing in the depths of space. The Merchants Guild, seeing their carefully maintained trade routes and alliances threatened by this unexpected diplomacy, had called an emergency session. And in the shadowy corners of the galaxy, other powers watched and waited, realizing that a simple bowl of soup might have just shifted the balance of power in ways no one had anticipated. As night fell, Terra returned to her kitchen to clean up, unaware that her next challenge would be even greater, preparing a feast that would either cement this newfound peace or see it shatter like crystal in a storm. The following week transformed New Haven from a forgotten colonial outpost into the most important diplomatic location in the galaxy. Representatives from a dozen species had arrived to witness what was being called the Convergence, the first joint diplomatic summit between humans, Zentari, and Drachnid in known history. The Colonial Conference Center, hastily renovated for the occasion, hummed with activity. But the real center of operations was Terra's kitchen, now expanded with equipment from 3 different species' culinary traditions. She stood at the center of this cultural crossroads, consulting ancient recipes provided by both Zentari and Drachnid historians. The molecular structure of this herb, a Zentari food scientist named Vexare explained, pointing to a holographic display, matches perfectly with descriptions in our oldest texts. And here, they switched to another image, the same compound appears in Drachnid cave paintings. Terra nodded, making notes in her grandmother's old recipe book. And when combined with earth ginger, it creates a reaction that works on all 3 species and neural pathways. It's like the universe wanted us to find this connection. She had spent days preparing for the summit's opening feast, combining elements from all 3 cultures into what she hoped would be more than just a meal, a bridge between worlds. The pressure was enormous, but Terra found herself strangely calm. In the kitchen, everything made sense. The Merchants Guild had sent observers, their cybernetic eyes recording everything. They stood out in their sleek corporate attire, trying to look inconspicuous and failing miserably. Terra noticed them watching her work, their expressions unreadable behind their augmented facades. "They're afraid," her father observed quietly as he helped her prepare ingredients. "All these years they've maintained power by keeping species separate, controlling trade routes. And here you are, bringing everyone together with soup." Terra was about to respond when her hand brushed against both the Zentari crystal and Drachnid scale in her pocket. Both thrummed with unusual intensity. She had learned to trust these artifacts' warnings. "Something's wrong," she whispered, just as the kitchen's environmental alarms began to flash. The Zentari guards reacted instantly, moving to protect Terra, but she was already in motion. "The ventilation system," she shouted, pointing to the subtle shimmer in the air near the ceiling. "Someone's introduced something into the air supply." The room erupted into chaos. Security forces evacuated diplomats while environmental teams rushed to contain the contamination. But Terra stood her ground, her mind racing. The shimmer in the air looked familiar, she'd seen something similar when mixing certain volatile ingredients. "Wait," she called out, her voice cutting through the panic. "I know what this is." She rushed to her ingredient stores, pulling out various herbs and roots. "It's a catalyst," she explained to the bewildered security teams. "Designed to react with our food and make everyone sick. But if I can neutralize it." Working with practiced precision, Terra began combining ingredients. The Zentari scientist, Vexare, caught on quickly and joined her, their crystalline hands moving with surprising dexterity. Together, they created a counteragent that, when vaporized, would neutralize the contamination. As they worked, security forces cornered 2 Merchants Guild observers attempting to flee. The sabotage had been meant to disgrace Terra and destroy the budding alliance, making everyone believe they'd been poisoned by her food. But instead of destroying trust, the incident strengthened it. Zentari, Drachnid, and human security forces worked seamlessly together to secure the facility. The shared threat had united them even further. Hours later, with the crisis averted and the saboteurs in custody, the diplomatic feast began as planned. The grand hall was filled with representatives from all three species, plus observers from a dozen other races. The air hummed with conversation in multiple languages. Terra's menu told a story, appetizers that highlighted each culture's unique traditions, soups that combined elements from all three worlds, and main courses that represented their shared future. But the centerpiece was a dish she called convergence broth, a refined version of her original healing soup that had started everything. As the meal progressed, something remarkable happened. The Zentari's crystalline features began pulsing in harmony with the drachnid scale patterns. Humans found themselves understanding subtle alien expressions they'd never been able to read before. The food was doing more than nourishing bodies, it was bridging neural and cultural gaps that had existed for millennia. Governor Wei stood to make a speech, but found herself interrupted by the drachnid commander who had first tasted Terra's soup. "Words are unnecessary," they announced, their scales shimmering with emotion. "This meal speaks for itself. We are tasting our shared past, and our shared future." Kexley, the Zentari diplomat, raised their drinking vessel. "To the one who showed us the way. Not through force or politics, but through wisdom carried in the humblest of vessels, a bowl of soup." All eyes turned to Terra, who blushed but stood tall. The crystal and scale in her pocket thrummed in perfect harmony, and in that moment, she understood something profound. Sometimes the greatest changes don't come from grand gestures or military might, but from simple acts of caring, from the wisdom passed down through generations, and from the willingness to share what you have with those in need. As the feast continued, news of the failed sabotage and its aftermath spread throughout the galaxy. The Merchants Guild's influence began to crumble as species after species realized that cooperation might be more profitable than separation. And in the kitchen of a small colonial settlement, a young girl had unknowingly started a revolution, one bowl of soup at a time. 1 year after the historic feast at New Haven, the colony had transformed beyond recognition. Where once stood a few modest biodomes now rose the Galactic Culinary Academy, its crystalline spires and organic architecture reflecting the merged aesthetics of three civilizations. At its heart was a kitchen unlike any other in the known universe, a place where the boundaries between science, diplomacy, and cooking blurred into something entirely new. Terra stood at her familiar workstation, now surrounded by students from 24 different species. At 13, she was still the youngest instructor in the academy, but no one questioned her authority anymore. Not after everything that had happened. "The key isn't just mixing ingredients," she explained to her class, demonstrating with practiced hands. "It's understanding why they work together. Every plant, every mineral, tells a story of connection. Our ancestors, whether they had skin or scales or crystal facets, knew these connections. They just forgot them over time." The Zentari crystal and drachnid scale, now incorporated into a pendant she always wore, hummed in agreement. Over the past year, xenoarchaeologists had discovered similar artifacts across the galaxy, each resonating with the same harmonic frequency. They were pieces of a puzzle no one had known needed solving. In orbit above New Haven, the newly established Galactic Culinary Council maintained a permanent presence. The massive station, shaped like an ancient cooking vessel, served as both embassy and research center. Representatives from formerly hostile species worked side by side, studying the growing database of shared culinary heritage that Terra and her students were helping to build. "Ambassador Terra," a voice called from the kitchen entrance. It was Raj, still adjusting to his daughter's formal title. "The council is ready for your presentation." Terra nodded to her students and followed her father to the transportation pad. In the year since the feast, she had grown taller, more confident, but she still carried her grandmother's old recipe book everywhere she went. The council chamber was packed with representatives from across the galaxy. The Merchants Guild, much diminished but not destroyed, had seats now too, though their influence had shifted from controlling trade routes to facilitating cultural exchange. "Honored representatives," Terra began, standing before the assembled dignitaries. 1 year ago, we discovered that food could bridge gaps we thought were unbridgeable. Today, I'm here to present our latest findings. She activated a holographic display showing molecular structures that danced and combined in complex patterns. We've identified over 300 compounds that appear in the ancient records of multiple species. Each one represents a point of connection, a shared heritage we're only beginning to understand. The chamber erupted in excited murmurs as Terra continued, but more importantly, we've discovered something extraordinary. When these compounds are combined properly, they don't just heal bodies, they enhance neural patterns that facilitate understanding between species. In other words, they help us truly comprehend each other. She gestured to a group of students who began distributing small cups to the assembled representatives. What you're about to taste is something we call unity broth. It contains elements from 17 different worlds, each contributing to a whole that's greater than its parts. As the representatives sipped, their reactions were immediate and profound. Zentari crystals pulsed in harmony with drachnid scales. Human pupils dilated in patterns that matched alien biochemical responses. For a moment, the chamber was silent as ancient neural pathways, dormant for millennia, reactivated. This is more than food, Terra explained softly. It's a reminder that despite our differences, despite the vast distances between our worlds, we share a connection deeper than we ever imagined. Every time we cook together, every time we share a meal, we strengthen that connection. The Council's response was unprecedented. They voted unanimously to establish culinary diplomacy as a fundamental principle of interstellar relations. New Haven would become the center of this initiative, with similar academies to be built across the galaxy. Later that evening, Terra stood in her original kitchen, the place where everything had started. Her father found her there, making her grandmother's simple healing soup. "Your grandmother would be proud," he said, watching her work. Though I doubt even she imagined her recipes would change the course of galactic history. Terra smiled, stirring the soup thoughtfully. She always said that cooking was about love, about wanting others to thrive. Maybe that's what the galaxy needed all along. Not grand treaties or trade agreements, but simple acts of caring, shared one bowl at a time. The pendant at her neck hummed warmly, and through the kitchen window, she could see ships from a dozen worlds moving peacefully through New Haven's purple sky. Each carried students, diplomats, and chefs, all coming to learn the art of culinary diplomacy. In the years that followed, Terra's story would be told across the galaxy, the tale of a young girl who dared to offer soup to strangers and ended up transforming interstellar relations. But perhaps more importantly, her grandmother's recipe book, filled with notes and wisdom passed down through generations, became a template for a new kind of diplomacy, one that recognized that the path to peace often began in the kitchen. And in kitchens across the galaxy, beings of all species learned to cook together, sharing not just recipes but stories, traditions, and dreams of a future where differences were celebrated and ancient connections renewed. They called it the culinary peace, and it all started with a simple bowl of soup, offered by a child who saw not enemies or aliens, but simply people who needed help.